Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, An Archaeology of the Human Sciences, 1966, is one of the most influential and complex works of 20th century philosophy. In this book, Foucault does not merely study the history of ideas, he investigates the deep structures of thought that determine what can be known, said, and thought in different historical epochs. It is a study of the changing orders of knowledge, the frameworks within which humans understand the world and themselves. The core idea, the episteme. At the heart of the order of things lies Foucault's concept of the episteme, the underlying set of relations that defines the conditions of possibility for knowledge in a given time. An episteme is not a theory or a worldview, but a structure of thought that unconsciously shapes what counts as true or meaningful. Each era, according to Foucault, has its own episteme, which organizes language, science, and perception. Foucault's method, which he calls archaeology, does not seek linear progress or causal explanations. Instead, it exposes the hidden rules that govern the formation of discourses, the statements and systems of meaning that define knowledge. The archaeologist does not trace the evolution of ideas, but uncovers the discontinuities and ruptures that separate one system of thought from another. From the Renaissance to the Classical Age, Foucault begins his study in the Renaissance, when resemblance and analogy governed knowledge. The world was perceived as a network of correspondences between stars and plants, the body and the cosmos, symbols and meanings. Language mirrored the world in a symbolic way, and knowledge was based on interpreting these resemblances. With the Classical Age, the 17th and 18th centuries, this structure of thought underwent a radical transformation. Instead of resemblance, order and representation became central. Knowledge now meant classification, arranging things into tables and systems according to their visible characteristics. Nature, language, and wealth were studied through taxonomy, grammar, and the new political economy. Foucault explores this period through examples from natural history, linguistics, and economics. He shows that in the classical episteme, words and things corresponded directly. Language was a transparent medium for representing reality. Knowledge aimed at total visibility and order. Everything could, in principle, be named, described, and organized. This was also the age of representation, the belief that the mind could mirror the structure of reality. The sciences of the time sought to describe what was visible, measurable, and classifiable. Yet, for Foucault, this clarity concealed a deep epistemological structure that dictated what could count as true knowledge. The birth of man in the modern episteme. Foucault's most famous and provocative claim is that man is a recent invention. In his analysis, the modern concept of man, as both the subject and object of knowledge, emerged only at the end of the 18th century. The modern episteme replaced the classical one through a profound rupture, marking the birth of the human sciences, biology, economics, linguistics, psychology. In the modern era, knowledge no longer simply classified what was visible. Instead, it turned toward uncovering the hidden structures behind phenomena, the organic processes of life, the productive mechanisms of labor, and the unconscious rules of language. Human beings became both the knowing subject and the object to be known. This transformation created the figure of man as a finite, empirical being who nonetheless seeks to know himself. Modern thought, therefore, is characterized by a paradox, the attempt of human beings to become the foundation of all knowledge while being determined by historical, biological, and linguistic forces beyond their control. Foucault's analysis is strikingly anti-humanist. He argues that the idea of man as the center of knowledge is not timeless or universal, but a historical construct, one that may eventually disappear when a new episteme emerges. His famous line captures this idea, open quote, "Man is an invention of recent date, and one perhaps nearing its end. If those arrangements were to disappear, man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea." Close quote. Archaeology of knowledge and the role of language. Language plays a central role throughout the order of things. For Foucault, the relationship between words and things is never stable or natural. It is determined by the structure of the episteme. In the Classical Age, language was a transparent medium, a tool for representing reality. In the modern age, however, language becomes opaque. It is now seen as a system of signs with its own rules, independent of human intention. This shift reflects a broader movement from representation to structure, from visible order to invisible systems. Foucault's approach foreshadows structuralism, but it also goes beyond it. He is less interested in structures themselves than in the historical transformations that make certain structures possible. Foucault's method avoids searching for continuity or progress. Instead, it identifies discontinuities, moments when one episteme gives way to another. History, in this view, is not a linear development toward truth, but a series of ruptures, each creating a new order of thought. Critique of humanism and the myth of progress. One of the most challenging aspects of the order of things is its rejection of the Enlightenment notion of progress. Foucault denies that knowledge advances in a straight line toward truth. What we call progress is merely a shift from one episteme to another, governed by new rules of formation and exclusion. Each system of thought defines what counts as knowledge, what can be said, and what must remain unsaid. The human sciences, anthropology, psychology, sociology, claim to study man objectively, yet they are themselves products of the modern episteme that invented their object of study. Foucault therefore sees them as self-referential and historically contingent, rather than universal sciences of human nature. His critique of humanism dismantles the belief that human reason and subjectivity are timeless sources of meaning. Instead, he argues that the subject, the knowing self, is historically produced through discourse and social practices. The death of man that Foucault predicts is not a nihilistic statement, but an anticipation of a future episteme that will no longer center knowledge on the human subject. Knowledge, power, and the continuation of Foucault's project. Although the order of things does not yet develop Foucault's later theory of power, knowledge, it anticipates it. By showing that every system of knowledge depends on rules that determine what can be said, Foucault prepares the ground for his later argument that knowledge and power are inseparable. In Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, Foucault would explore how these epistemic rules are embedded in institutions, schools, prisons, hospitals, and how they shape human behavior. The order of things thus stands as the conceptual foundation of this later work, offering a historical map of how knowledge organizes human experience. Structure of the book. The book itself is dense and complex, organized around analyses of three major disciplines. 1. Biology, which replaces natural history by studying life as a process rather than as classification. 2. Economics, which replaces wealth and exchange with production and labor. 3. Linguistics, which replaces general grammar with the study of language as a structured system. Through these case studies, Foucault shows how the modern sciences redefine knowledge, replacing representation with structure and visibility with depth. Beneath these transformations lies a deeper shift: the emergence of man as both the center and the limit of knowledge. The Order of Things is not just a book about science or history. It is a philosophical reflection on the very conditions of thought. Foucault reveals that our categories of reason, truth, and subjectivity are not eternal but contingent products of historical arrangements. What we take to be self-evident, human nature, reason, progress, are themselves constructs that can dissolve when the episteme changes. This insight has profound consequences for philosophy, social theory, and cultural studies. It undermines the metaphysical foundations of modern thought and replaces them with a historical, critical approach to knowledge. Foucault's archaeology thus becomes a method for thinking the limits of our own era, for asking how our ways of knowing came to be and how they might end. Conclusion. Michel Foucault's The Order of Things remains one of the most challenging and transformative works in modern philosophy. It calls into question the very idea of a stable human subject or continuous intellectual progress. By tracing the shifting conditions that make knowledge possible, Foucault exposes the fragility of our intellectual foundations. The book invites readers to look at history not as a story of discovery, but as a sequence of changing frameworks that define what can be thought and known. Its ultimate message is both unsettling and liberating, that the order of things, the systems through which we perceive truth, reason, and humanity, is never permanent. Just as man once emerged as a figure of modern thought, so too may this figure vanish, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea.